Good morning, and on behalf of the board and the entire IMSA community, I also want to welcome you to this wonderful professional development, professional learning day, and also give a nice shout out to Mary Beth McCarthy and our music students, my appreciation to them, and also Susan Bissinger. Susan, are you here? She's probably at the registration date. She is our staff person who has had the lead in putting together today's program, and we're very appreciative to her and to all of her efforts. Most of all, we're very glad that all of you are here. You've come from 11 counties around the state to participate. You include some IMSA alumni, and that's always a special treat for us. And speaking of IMSA alumni, without any further ado, I'm really proud to introduce our keynote speaker today, Sendhil Revuluri, who is a graduate of our class of 1990, which was our second graduating class. Now, Sendhil graduated at the time when I was Dean of Students. That was the first role that I held here at IMSA, as I like to say, way back when the dinosaurs roamed the face of the earth. So I'm one of the charter staff members who's been here since the very beginning, and my job was really to provide the leadership in starting the Student Life program, which included residential life. Now, Sendhil was one of our young students who came in chronologically several years younger than his peers. And maybe later today, if you catch me in the hall, I will tell you about some of the conversations that I had to have with him when he was a young student here, some of the pranks in the residence halls, some of my conversations with his parents. But at any rate, fast forward to today, it really is fun to see that our talented young students have grown up and are now thriving personally and professionally. Sendhil is exceptionally talented as a mathematician, as an educator, and as a business leader. He's heavily involved in improving teaching and learning for people of all ages, and I'm thrilled and honored to welcome him back to IMSA to speak on the important question, do you know where your students are? Sendhil?
Thank you, Kathy, for that really nice introduction and for not mentioning all of those stories right now. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I definitely want to get to talking about our students, but I wanted to start with thinking about two extremely important objects for everyone here. Here's one, and here's the other. I don't think they need any introduction because none of us would be here without them. They're here so you can see them. Actually, if I made them to scale, it would look more like this. But that would make the Earth kind of hard to see. So here they are again. I have one simple question to get us started. Does the Earth go around the sun, or does the sun go around the Earth? None of you are answering, not because you don't know, because you're like, why is this guy asking me this question? Well, I know you all know, but it turns out that the National Science Foundation periodically does surveys of science knowledge among Americans, and they just presented their latest survey results from a few years ago, a couple weeks ago in Chicago. And it turns out that 74% of Americans gave the correct answer to this question, which, if you do the subtraction, means that about 26% gave the other answer to the question. In other audiences, it might not go without saying that you all know. But that's not really my question. My question is, how do you know? So I see almost everyone here is sitting close enough to someone else to talk to them, which will be helpful, because I'll be asking you to do so several times in the next 40 minutes or so. Go ahead, talk to that person, see if you can come up with some reasons why it is the way that you know it is. To answer that question, and my usual MO is not to be up on a stage. I would be, next to you and eavesdropping and asking you questions while you were talking. But since I'm not with you, could I just have some finger signals? Give me a thumbs up in front of your chest if you feel like with whoever you talk to, you are like, yes, we know why this is the case, how we know that it's one answer and not the other. And give me a thumbs down if you feel like, we weren't actually able to come up with observable evidence that would settle the question, and maybe a sideways if it's somewhere in between. Okay, so I'm seeing some diversity in the responses. which, I just have to say, this is not a random question I came up with just to harass you. As Kathy mentioned, I went to IMSA, I had wonderful science teachers here and before. I was a physics major in college. And yet, when I got this question on the first day of a history of science course, I realized I didn't really have a good way to settle it. Most of the observable facts that we see, certainly in the course of our everyday lives, don't fit better with one model than the other. We have day and night. The sun rises on one side and it sets on another. We have phases of the moon. We have all these things that we see, like the planets move relative to the stars when we watch them night after night. But all of those facts could be explained by either model. It actually took quite a bit of time and quite a few advances in terms of mathematics, in terms of measuring technology, like telescopes, for the question to be settled one way or another. And I know it's a little hard to see, but do you see those little circles around the big circles in the top model where the Earth is at the center? When you include those little epicycles, which was the previous model that, from the Egyptians on, was the way to explain where the planets were each day, your agreement with how things moved was pretty good. You can even explain this, what you call retrograde motion. If you look carefully at Mars night after night, there are times when it looks like it stops moving forward and starts moving backwards and starts moving again in the usual direction. And the heliocentric model, where you had the sun at the center, it actually had its own flaws in explaining this. And it wasn't until that was refined to include ellipses instead of circles that it even did as well as the Earth-centered model. So all this is to say, this seems like a pretty silly question. It's one that maybe in today's society we expect everyone to know the answer because we'd rather not start from scratch every time we're having these conversations. But in terms of actually doing science, of reasoning from evidence, it's not that easy. So I just want us to keep this in mind. I'm going to ask you another question now. And this question is apropos for the winter we're having now. Why are there seasons? I'm not saying why are there seasons in Chicago, or why do we live here instead of living somewhere nice? I'm saying why are there seasons on the planet Earth? So go ahead, talk to your neighbor again. See if you can come up with reasons that we have seasons. So how many people felt like this was an easier question to get your head around than the last question? How do we know that the Earth goes around the sun rather than vice versa? Okay. So I'm about to show you a video, a little part of a much bigger video. I apologize for the poor image quality because it's from the 80s. I also apologize for the poor fashion sense of the people involved. But I'm just going to tell you this was taken on graduation day at Harvard University. If you've seen this before, which you very well may have, hold on just a minute before you drop any spoilers on the people next to you. And they are going to be asked a very similar question to what I just asked you. And let's see what they say. So I was told by someone recently that if you're presenting, it's really important to have a joke in case something like this happens. And I said, that's ridiculous. That kind of thing never happens. And besides, all the math jokes I know will just make people groan. But that's all I got. So the joke is, why was 6 afraid of 7? Some of you have heard this before. Good. Well, it's because 7, 8, 9. Okay, at least some of you are being nice and laughing. So I'm going to punt on showing you the video right now because you can't see it online. And in the electronic version of the slides that's going to be posted on the Digital Commons, I'll have a link to getting the video. So in the video, there are interviews with these Harvard graduates who, I think by most normal standards, people would say are pretty well educated. And they're asked the same question that I just asked you, why are there seasons? But the answer, as you can get from this young man gesturing now, almost every single one of them answered that there are seasons because in the summer, the Earth is closer to the sun. And in the winter, the Earth is further from the sun. And every single one of these students successfully navigated elementary, middle school, high school, graduated from high school, got into Harvard, graduated from Harvard. I'm pretty sure that through that time, there weren't many people in a class telling them that this was the case. But they had this idea nonetheless. In fact, there were probably people telling them at least a few times that something else was the case, that it's not actually about the distance from the sun. The distance from the sun really doesn't change that much. And anyway, the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere are the same distance from the sun, more or less, every time we look around. It's not a question of distance. It's a question of how the rays of the sun hit the Earth and how the Earth happens to be tilted. And they were probably instructed upon this the way our education system works, at least once in elementary school, at least once in middle school, at least once in high school, maybe even in college, depending on what courses they took. But that's not what they said. They didn't say that, oh, it's because of the tilt of the Earth's axis and the way that the light hits the Earth. They went back to this really appealing notion that's really consistent with our everyday experience that it's not how we stand next to a fire that affects how warm we are, it's how close we are. And I think this tells us something really important about our students' minds, any students' minds. They're not blank slates. And they're not empty pails that we can just go ahead and fill with knowledge. I think the analogy that's come closest for me is that they're more like a prairie. There's a whole bunch of stuff there already. Some of it is nice. We like it. Some of it is kind of confusing. We're not quite sure how it got there. Probably no one went and put it there, but it was just growing there all along. Some of it's really beautiful, and some of it is seriously problematic. But it's there whether we like it or not. And it's going to be there whether someone teaches the kids those ideas or not, because they're really intuitive. They're appealing from everyday experience. If you study the history of science, it's easy for us to say, oh, we feel so superior. Aristotle thought heavy things fall faster than light things. Well, it wasn't just him, and he was actually pretty smart. A lot of people thought that. And it's very counterintuitive to say that it doesn't matter the size or the density of an object, they all fall with the same gravitational acceleration. You have to do some work to get there. So in my prairie analogy, misconceptions are like weeds. They're there, no one had to plant them, no one has to take care of them, they're just there. But if we're going to be planting something else, something that's not the weeds, something that is helpful to move that student's understanding forward, to maybe build on and advance, we can't ignore the weeds. We have to do something about them. So the whole thing with the seasons is one, I think, really compelling example of a misconception. Another one is what kids do in terms of operations when they go from whole numbers, which are pretty intuitive for most kids, to other things, which often are not. So a kid will say 2 + 4 = 6. Once they get the correspondence down between the way you write numbers and what they mean, that seems reasonable. They can use tools, as simple as their fingers, counters, whatever, and they can establish that that's always the case. 3 + 5 = 8. Great, same way. When we make this leap out of the whole numbers and we look at something like fractions, this makes a lot of sense. If I take 2/3 + 4/5, why wouldn't it equal 6/8? I mean, I know you all know it doesn't, okay? But why wouldn't it? It makes so much sense. It's so intuitive. And if kids are still operating with those preconceptions that really worked all along until they left the warm embrace of the whole numbers, they're going to think that this makes sense, and it's really hard to tell them different. We have to get them to change their minds, and that's not easy. So what do? We do not have the equivalent of a mental weed whacker. It does not exist. I think it would be kind of messy if it did. We can't just go in and say, let's plow all these misconceptions aside. We can't ignore them. we can't just build on top of them because they're still there just like weeds and they'll keep coming up amid all the nice things that we think we've planted and make everything seem very confused. So, it's really important that we deal with misconceptions. This is Grant Wiggins, who probably a lot of folks have heard of, read, and so on. He says mere teaching, no matter how precise, is insufficient to overcome widespread, naive, and erroneous thinking about key ideas. And from this quote I've pulled, it seems like, oh, these misconceptions, they're wrong, they're naive, they're erroneous. But naive is not a pejorative term here. Naive just means this is what you would think if you hadn't really done some careful investigation. And that makes those beliefs very strong. And they happen to be erroneous, but you might not know that until you try to build on them. Your whole intuition about whole numbers is totally fine until you try to apply that to fractions. So we have to do something that isn't just mere teaching. There is a publication called How People Learn from the National Research Council back in 2000 that brought together a lot of research about how people, including young people, learn. And one of their points is that teachers must draw out and work with the preconceptions, the pre-existing understandings that their students bring with them. We can't ignore them. We have to work with them. Sometimes there's stuff we can build with, and sometimes there's stuff that's really annoying and problematic, and we wish they didn't know anything, but wishing doesn't make it so. So this is one of my main points, that we have to acknowledge that kids have misconceptions, and we have to plan for that in what we're doing. Otherwise, we get this situation that I certainly experienced firsthand, where I teach algebra to 9th graders, and I teach algebra to 10th graders, and I teach algebra to 11th graders. And I'm not just talking about the kids who repeat, though many of them, I was wondering, who taught you algebra in 9th grade? And I realized it was me. But even the kids who pass the course the first time, and then they see a topic or a notation or a particular idea again a year or two later, and you realize nothing stuck. What did stick was what they thought before, because that's just stronger than whatever we might plant unless we really address it directly. So another idea that I want to share is that it's not just about where we're going. You're all here today, so you clearly got here. You all knew where you were going. I suspect not all of you were coming from the same place. And so if you were coming from the Sears Tower, or if you were coming from O'Hare, you would have different directions to get here. So, if you went online and you said, hey, give me directions, Google Maps or whatever, you'll notice that there are two things you have to put in. You didn't just say, hey, I'm going to IMSA for Professional Learning Day. You have to say where you were starting from. Maybe some of you have fancier devices, like a smartphone or a GPS device, that took care of that for you. But, that knew where you were because of billions of dollars of satellites that happened to be up there. It wasn't trivial either way, whether you had to explicitly tell your navigator or it had to figure it out by itself. We really have to know where we're starting from. It's not just where we're going. And I want to reiterate this point, not just in this analogy world, but in our world of teaching. It's really easy for us to be consumers of someone else who has put in a great deal of effort developing standards or even developing curricular materials that go into great detail about where the kids are going, where we want them to get, what we want them to learn. But the hard work is not being the consumer of that, it's being the constructor of how do we get there? And that depends on us knowing what our students know right now, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. So that, I think, is a really important point that gets overridden. Certainly in my first couple years teaching, I thought, well, shouldn't I be writing all my own stuff? Because that seems more interesting and more important than just focusing on my students and making sure they're learning every day. But I've come to believe that focusing on our own students and making sure they're learning, starting with what they know now, is far more important and far more complex and intellectually demanding than developing curricular materials that are sort of one size fits all. Because most students won't learn that way. And that's why everyone in this room is really important. Because most of your students probably won't just learn on their own given a book in their hands. And your role in terms of figuring out what they know and what to do about it is really crucial. So how do we do this? It would be really nice if we could look into kids' minds and see what was there. But as far as I know, we can neither look nor see what's there. How do we figure out what they know so we know what to do next? I think the fundamental process here is one of kind of exposing what kids know. It's through questioning, it's through assessment, it's through giving them activities that make it clearer to them and clearer to us what they're thinking. So to use another analogy, suppose you have a fever and you go to the doctor. The doctor is unlikely to immediately jump to a diagnosis, let alone a treatment, because the fever by itself doesn't really tell you what the underlying problem is. Is the right treatment to give you some antibiotics? Is it to put a bag of ice on your head? Right? You don't know yet. You have to figure out what's actually going on underneath the surface. And I think there's analogous situations in schools where we say a kid got a wrong answer, or a kid is saying something that doesn't seem quite right. We may have to dig underneath that to figure out what's going on. Except I think we actually have a harder job, because we don't have something so specific as the kid has a fever. Often the assessments that we have or that exist in the world around us that we all live in don't give us something nice and specific like that. There's something more like, you have a health score of 78. That's red. And implicitly what it's saying is, good luck. Hope you get better. Because a health score of 78, I figure, could correspond to a broken leg, which means you should probably get a cast. Or it could correspond to you have obscenely high cholesterol and you might need to get on medication. One treatment is not going to help with the other condition. And yet that's what we seem to get a lot of the time with the big test, or the test for the big test that a lot of districts use. Or even a lot of kinds of assessments that we might draw from that might be perfectly fine for the purpose of assessing how much has a student mastered or has a student made progress. And some people would assert, I disagree, saying, oh, how good a teacher are you? But they're completely useless for anything we might actually do with that, which is, what does the student think and what do I do about it? So we have to get past being distracted by overall, how's the student doing? Are they doing well or not? And say, really, what is the student thinking? So one last story before I offer some possible responses to this. There was an episode of I Love Lucy where Ricky Ricardo comes home. Lucy is on her hands and knees in the living room looking for something. And he says, Lucy, what are you looking for? She said, well, I'm looking for my keys. I lost them. He said, so where'd you lose them? I lost them in the bedroom. And he says, you're in the living room, but you lost them in the bedroom. How are you going to find your keys? She said, well, I tried looking in the bedroom, but the light is so much better here that I thought I would look here instead. Now, it's funny because she's not going to find her keys, right? And the reason that this story came to mind for me is that we often get distracted by where the light is better, where we might find some answer to some question. It's just not the question we have. It's not the question we're trying to answer about what does a student understand and what do they not understand and what do I do about it. We get distracted with these other things. So I'll give you a real example. In most standards, in Illinois standards, other state standards, other country standards, now in the Common Core, kids are expected sometime in elementary school to know something about measuring two-dimensional shapes, like rectangles. So you might have a question like this. A rectangle has a particular length and width. What's its perimeter? So I'd like you to think about this question, not to figure out the answer, because I'm confident you can all do that, but I'm going to ask you two harder questions related to that. What do you think students would do to figure this out? And what answers, right or wrong, do you think they'd come up with to this question? Okay, so for this as the prompt, what might students do and what answers might they come up with? So please go ahead and talk to your neighbor again. So I know, I can see some of you look like you're computing this in whatever way. 19.98 happens to be the product of those two numbers in the question. 18.2, you probably figured out a minute ago, is each of those numbers counted twice and all added up, which seems to make sense as far as you're thinking about perimeter. But what's going on with the choices in the second question? Why might a student pick a choice besides the right answer that you all came up with already before you had any choices? Yeah. right? It's familiar. It seems like an appropriate thing to say in math class. Like bananas is probably not an appropriate unit for math class, but square centimeters seems safe enough. That might indicate sort of a deeper confusion about what's perimeter and what's area, which I was just talking with some teachers last week, and there were 6th grade teachers in that group, and there were 10th grade teachers in that group, and they both expressed the same frustration that kids are still not really clear on the difference between perimeter and area, not just as vocabulary terms, but as actual measurements. And so, when we look at this question, well, the same question, but different answer choices, we're kind of setting it up to tell us something different. We've gone looking in a different place. We've shined our light in a different place, and we're going to find different stuff out. So, if we had the luxury of always asking the open-ended question, we wouldn't have to be so good at anticipating what students think and what they're going to respond and what that might mean. We could just get this rich information back and let that happen. And sometimes that's really important to do because you don't know what's going to happen. But the world we live in, the number of students that each of you, I'm sure, work with, all the assessments that exist out beyond our circle of control, you're going to see a lot of items like this. And you have to be very careful. You got to be a critical consumer of what these look like, because it's really important to measure what matters, even if it's not so easy. If we just have questions that look like this, we might be very confident that kids understand perimeter, when really they may often have this really big misconception about perimeter versus area that the first set of options doesn't surface at all. And so it may be more work, it may be harder, it may be messier, but we've got to shine the light where we think we're going to find the real issues in our students' thinking. And we have to use what we understand about the discipline and our knowledge of students, the students you're working with now or other students you've worked with before, your colleagues' knowledge of students, really good instructional materials will anticipate these things, to really get in front of what's going on here. So, I'd say that I've said that I have a modest goal for assessment items because I've had to build these items, and I've totally been guilty of making items like the first ones, because it's really easy to make those distractors, those wrong answers, based on a computational error. It's really easy. And if you've got to make 40 of them, then you're going to end up doing that because you run out of time to make them all really good. But that leaves the teacher as the consumer of what's going on kind of high and dry. It leaves the student with a mistaken impression of what they understand and what they don't. And that's not good because it's a shaky foundation for what's going forward. So I would say that I have a modest goal for assessment items. Kids get the item right for the right reason, and they get it wrong for the right reason. And by the right reason, I mean whether they understand the objective. Kind of implicit in that is that we have an objective. We have some idea of what we'd like students to learn and what the issue is we were trying to diagnose. So we can use multiple choice items, but their efficiency comes with a demand on us to be very intentional about their use. So it's just a caution I want to share. You can have a good task. You can make it a lot more efficient by making it multiple choice, but we have to really think about that. We have to think about our content, all the connections in the discipline, and we have to think about our students and what we think they know, what they might struggle with. So this person is Dylan William. He's sort of a giant in the field of educational assessment. And in one of his recent books, he has a quote that assessment is the central process of instruction. And his reason for that is that students don't learn what we teach. If they did, we wouldn't need to keep grade books. We could just have a record of what we taught. And that would be so much easier because you wouldn't need a lot of rows in your grade book. You just have one for yourself. And that's what you taught, and that would be fine. We know that's not true. So it's really important that we keep this in mind, that us understanding what kids know before instruction and during and after is absolutely central to what we're doing. This comes from his book, Embedded Formative Assessment, which is really one of the best books I've read in the last few years. So I really recommend it. One more multiple choice item before getting to what can we do about this. The question is, why do students have to do math problems? Option A, to get the answers, because Homeland Security needs them pronto. Option B, I had to, why shouldn't they? Option C, so they'll listen to me in class. And while I may be tempted to pick option C pretty often, there's also option D, which is to learn mathematics. This comes from Phil Darrow, who is one of the authors of the Common Core State Standards in Mathematics. And he is arguing that the only rational answer is option D. And if that's the case, we have to be very careful about how we use problems in class. He says answers are like a black hole. It's hard to escape their pull. So we have to be very intentional about how we use problems and their answers. And I'm just going to say, because I have the mic and you don't, the reason we give students problems to solve is so that they learn. This is the product. This is the purpose of this whole activity of teaching, so students learn. The problems and the answers are tools to get to that product. They help students learn. They're part of that process. They are not the end in and of themselves. So we have to be careful, which is really hard. I've done it many, many times, far more than I can keep track of, especially near the end of a lesson. We're like, oh, they're almost there. I want them to have the answer before they go. So let me help them get to the answer, which usually meant that I would just do the rest. Too fast for anyone to really understand what I was doing, but at least they had the answer before they left and the bell rang. Let's not let answer getting short-circuit kids making sense and reasoning and learning. So what Phil Darrow suggests is changing the question that we're asking ourselves. Rather than asking, how can I teach my kids to get the answer to this problem? Instead ask, how can I use this problem and its answer to teach the key ideas of this unit? So the problem and its answer change their role substantially. They're not the destination. They are something that's helping us get to the destination. So a few general points before 3 specific responses that I think are helpful. First, we want to make it safe for kids because their experience with math, not just in school, though by the time they get to each of us, they've had usually several years in school, but even in American culture, is that the answers matter. Getting the right answer is what matters the most, and what's second most is getting it first. So we have to explicitly make it safe for kids not to get the right answer, to maybe go a little more slowly because they're trying to understand, and to make it clear that that's what we value. And that will, I think, often encourage reasoning and sense-making, but sometimes we need to do a little more encouragement by the activities we ask kids to do, how we ask them to be in class, how we ask them to work with one another, and even our roles. I got tired very quickly of being called over by a student whose sole question was, is this right? I did not figure any remedy to that other than to refuse to answer that question and to shift the conversation to, how do you know? But that kind of shift is not easy. It's definitely not something where you're operating from a nice clear field. You're operating from that prairie where that's been planted a long time ago. And another thing is to value what we see. When we see students making mistakes, but having reasons, disagreeing productively with their peers, we need to value that, and not through either an intentional decision by us or by our school or colleagues or administrators, or by sort of not thinking about it, valuing only the fast and the right. So one little tool that seems to help is something developed by Phil Darrow and his team. It's called simply the 5x8 card. And I know you can't see anything that's on there. On the front of the card are the 8 standards for mathematical practice from the Common Core. If you Google 5x8 card, even if you don't look at my slides, you'll probably find it pretty quickly, especially with his name. On the back is the interesting part, because I have been in and talked to many people about these standards for mathematical practice, and I'm gradually coming to understand them better. But this I thought was really brilliant because it makes it super concrete. Things you would actually see in a classroom that give you evidence that those standards are in practice. One of them, just one for example, is students say a second sentence. And that's important because often the kid's first sentence is the answer, because that's what they've been socialized to do in math class. But it's with that second sentence that you get something like, because. And if we want them to reason and make sense, we really need to make sure that we see that second sentence and we press students to say that second sentence. And we value it when it comes. Whether the answer it's coming to is right or wrong will lead us to different responses, but it doesn't mean that second sentence is more or less valuable. What means it's more or less valuable is whether it impacts learning. So, we probably see thermometers and thermostats every day. question we could ask is, what's the difference? They both do some of the same things. They tell us what the temperature is. But the thermometer just does that. It's not connected to anything else. It can only tell us what the temperature is. A thermostat is different because it's part of a system that actually has a whole feedback loop. And that feedback loop exists because once we set the temperature and once the thermostat knows what the temperature is, it actually does something about it. If we don't have the doing something about it part, which is our jobs, then it's not a feedback loop. There's some literature on this back to the 1940s and even before from engineering and one of the aspects that I thought was kind of interesting that Dylan William quoted is that information turns into feedback if it's in a system that can be used to affect future performance. If it doesn't do that, it's not feedback. It's just information, and it's not going to make anything better. So there's an analogy from a video that's also linked by a guy named Tim Zerland, who has thought a lot about formative assessment in his own role as a teacher. He has this analogy that if you take your car for an inspection and you get a failing response, you don't just say, oh, I guess my car failed, off to the dump with you. You get a report that says these things are wrong with your car and you need to fix them before you can use it again legally on your road or renew your license plate or whatever. The key there is that you get that report, but also that you then take it and you get it fixed. Now, we do not have, just like we didn't have mental weed whackers, we don't have little brain wrenches. So how do we actually do that fixing? So I have 3 ideas that kind of build on those general principles. The first is something that was really, it really bugged me when I first heard it put this way, but I think it's right. And that's that confusion is a tool. The fancy word you might use is disequilibrium. I read something someone had written recently that said, before you can teach something, you have to realize it's hard. How many of you feel you've ever had a teacher in K-12 or college who did not realize it was hard? I sure did. I think that made them significantly less effective as a teacher. Clearly, this was not the criterion applied for them to be a teacher because they would not have been a teacher then. But this comment really made me think, and I think actually before you can learn something, at least something transformative, not just a new fact that you can blithely add to your existing store of knowledge, you have to realize it's hard before you can learn something. And so as another writer put it, entering a state of confusion is a prerequisite to true learning. And this draws from some of the research about doing demonstrations in science classes. Kids who had the wrong idea coming into the demonstration often left feeling like the demonstration actually confirmed their wrong idea. Even though from the teacher's perspective, it did nothing of the sort. It showed the wrong idea had to be wrong. The nice, clear demonstration actually reinforced the misconception. And the fix to that was getting the kids to be confused first. To say, so if your misconception were true, then what would happen? Okay, now let's see what actually happens. Do those two agree? Oh, they don't? Well, what does that mean? Maybe your misconception doesn't work. What could be another way? So minor things around the edges of that demonstration made a huge difference to what kids actually took away from it. So I would say that the real learning, which often entails taking those misconceptions that you have and setting them aside for something new, really requires real engagement. One sort of refinement of this whole idea of creating confusion is what's called peer instruction. The big name associated with this is Eric Mazur. He's a physicist at Harvard who's done really amazing work with nanoscale stuff, wires and heat conduction and all kinds of things. He's also done some really amazing work over the last now 20 years about physics education research. And so this model of peer instruction starts with posing a multiple choice question, but not just one where you're trying to surface, did a kid execute a procedure correctly? Did they make a mistake? But really conceptually challenging one. One, for instance, from a really widely used concept inventory that collects these questions is if you have a plane moving through the sky and it drops a package, what trajectory does that package take? And a lot of kids will say, well, it falls straight down from where the plane let it go. But if a kid has really understood their freshman physics course, that's the wrong answer. But the intuitively appealing answer is that it goes down. Some kids even say the plane keeps going and the package somehow starts going backwards. Because from the frame of reference of the plane, that is what we see. We've seen it all in documentaries about bombers in the Second World War or whatever. That's what it looks like. But the right answer is you have conservation of momentum in the x direction, and the package is going to fall, tracking underneath the plane more or less. And so you really expose students' thinking, and you make them do that on their own first. Then they vote. They share that information with the teacher in some very fast way. So you can have these clickers, but you can also use finger signals, you can use whiteboards, you can use voting cards that have different colors, whatever, so that they tell you, what do we think? Among A, B, C, and D, what do we think? And then you may say no real learning has happened yet, but those steps are essential for this response. Because if kids haven't thought about it first, when they're told the right answer, they'll say, oh yeah, that makes sense, and that misconception is still there. That response may involve the instructor, it may not. It may be more about the students teaching one another by discussing what they think. So How People Learn talks about a lot of fundamentals. Peer instruction kind of hits all of those pieces. It engages students' initial understanding. It helps students develop an organized conceptual framework, which I think is a fancy way of saying they think more like experts rather than like novices, where everything is disconnected and there's there's money problems and there's time problems and there's work problems. Instead of the expert's knowledge, someone who has an expert knowledge of Algebra 1 saying these are all algebraic problems, most of which can be represented with systems and solved that way. And it helps students see that they can take control of their thinking, which is really important if they're going to keep doing that going forward. So I think all of this sort of brings me back to this model. We are used to kind of thinking, or at least I'm used to thinking of myself as kind of being in the center. This is being reinforced by the fact that you're all sitting here looking at me and I'm holding a microphone. But that's not where I am, and that's not where you are in your classrooms. Your students are at the center. And you're kind of there, but whether you have succeeded in your job or not depends not on what you do and how energetic you are and how charismatic you are and all the good things you have to say. It depends on whether they learn. And to me, that was a pretty big shift that I'm still processing. But I think it has a lot of consequences. The third response that I think is helpful is something that we call a re-engagement lesson. It's something that was shared with us from collaboration in California and was developed by teachers through a lesson study process. The idea of re-engagement is that kids come back to a task that they've done before from a different perspective. And because it's a prior task, they're familiar with it. They're not totally occupied with how do I get the answer, because they've already gotten an answer. And it allows you to use the work that they and their peers generated from doing the task before and use it to make connections and build and move their learning forward. So some kids will have misconceptions, and by looking at other students' work and making sense of it, they might confront them and maybe fix them. Other kids may have already gotten it, but they'll make connections or they'll see a different method. But the idea is, the answers are kind of beside the point. We really want to move their learning forward. What I see is kind of common across these different methods is that they're somewhat uncomfortable. They definitely take work. So we have to be strategic about how and when we use them. We use them on the important ideas. We don't try to use them for 80 ideas in the course of a year. The other thing is that a lot of the learning seems to happen by kids thinking, but also talking, right? What fancy word is student discourse. So the more kids talk, the more confident they get. I think the first confidence they get is that this makes sense. This math stuff, this chemistry stuff, this physics stuff makes sense, which is not necessarily an assumption that kids walk into our classrooms with. The other thing they get confident about is that I can learn it. And I think this actually leads to a really virtuous cycle where they talk, they get confident, they talk more, and that cycle kind of throws off more learning. Two resources that have been really interesting, built on a lot of prior work, are two books published called 5 Practices for orchestrating mathematical discussions and also orchestrating discussions in the science classroom. And again, those will be in the slides that I shared. Two final ideas I wanted to share. One is that this whole thermostat analogy is nice, but it's clearly a radical oversimplification. Students are not like the components of a heating system. They're far more complicated. In particular, they have complicated personalities. These are our personalities. Karthik is 3.5, Mira is 2. They are already very independent, and they have their own ideas about what they want to do. They have their own identities, they have their own beliefs, and that just becomes more and more developed as kids get older. One really important aspect of that is what's often called mindset. Rather than giving you a definition, I'm going to give you some contrasting statements in these two mindsets that researchers have kind of defined. In a fixed mindset, someone might say, I have a certain amount of intelligence, and that's that. Growth mindset, very different. Say, I can grow my intelligence if I work on it. If I have to work hard, does that mean I'm not that smart? Or does it mean that when I work hard, that's how I get smarter? Are mistakes bad? Are they shameful? I should hide them? Or are they opportunities to learn? When I hit a setback, do I give up? Or do I work harder? We all have these mindsets. I would venture to guess that every single one of you, and me in this room, have both of these mindsets about different things in our lives. They're not unique to us as people. They're how we think about particular domains or areas of expertise that we may have or we may want. One is clearly more conducive to growing that expertise. This is a graphic. I know you can't really see the details, but I thought it was a really nice depiction of these ideas that on the green side with the growth mindset, every time you hit a challenge, it actually helps you grow your ability. While on the blue side, you kind of stick at the same ability and you don't make that progress. It would be so helpful if our students believed this about the subjects we're teaching. And a lot of this comes from Carol Dweck, who's a psychologist. She wrote a book called Mindset, which I recommend highly. It's actually a very fast read, really evocative of a lot of the things that are going on in kids' heads, in our heads, and what we can do about it. Because these mindsets matter. The students' mindsets about themselves, our mindsets about students, our mindsets about ourselves, they matter to what kids learn. And I think one particular way they matter is we have to believe that a bunch of people who don't necessarily know what's going on can figure it out by working together. And that's true for us as people, as teachers, and for our students. The plant didn't come from any one of these sources. In fact, if you take any subset of those sources, you're not getting a plant. But you put them all together and voila, there's a plant. That's really neat. And the same thing is happening in our classrooms if we create the conditions for it to happen. So I know we're running short of time. I just want to share a final couple thoughts. One is that what I'm laying out is definitely not easy, and I don't want anyone to leave with the impression that I think it's easy. It requires a lot of work. And if we're going to do that work, it's really important to work together. So I know, science and math crowd, you guys know about vectors. Consider that there are these 4 vectors. When you add them up, what are you going to get? Not much. Well, they're pretty big vectors, but what's wrong with them? Seeing someone do this. Yeah, they're acting at cross purposes. So let's say we get a little better, and we're kind of not at least actively working against each other. We get a lot more going on. But the real power comes from if we really get on the same page, have the same goal, the same destination, the same plan, we get some really amazing results. And I think these ideas go together with the ideas about learning and change, where people may have a fixed or a growth mindset, and their engagement and collaboration. If you have a fixed mindset and you're working on your own, it's very unlikely your practice is going to change or your results. If we can get to the point where we and our colleagues really believe that things can get better and we're willing to work together on it, that's where we get some really effective professional learning and some change. So the last idea I want to leave you with is that we've talked a lot sort of about the center, sort of what's going on in your classroom, your practice as an individual. And I've said a word about collaboration, how important that is. There's also sort of a broader context that we work in. And this was an image that popped into my head, but I realized it was incomplete. It actually goes in the other direction as well. So I would encourage you, hopefully some of the things I've said have been useful. I don't Imagine that anything I've said will spark something in your head that you weren't able to do before all by itself. But please access your professional learning networks. Those can be formal things like our professional organizations. They may be the online thing that all the young people are doing these days with Twitter and all its different hashtags like EdChat, MathChat, SciChat. People have blogs. They post on Quora, which is an interesting place to put questions and responses. People are sharing resources on Pinterest. So you have this whole connected educator movement going on. But I also just want to point out, unless it's not obvious, you're here. You're here with all these people, some of whom you work with every day and you'll see tomorrow, maybe Monday. Other folks you may not see that often, but they could be thinking about the same stuff. And as we move into new standards and new assessments that are more demanding, they go to what we call a depth of knowledge. That's not the low level of recalling, recognizing procedural knowledge, but really explaining, concluding, justifying, making connections. And the assessments go from very little stuff being assessed at the higher level to a lot of stuff being assessed at the higher level with PARC and Smarter Balanced and whatever is coming for the science assessments. We need to be ready for that shift. And we need to get our students ready for that shift. And I think it's really important that we realize the magnitude of what we're looking at, that we work together, and that we be explicit about that shift with our students. Grant Wiggins likes to use soccer analogies, and he says, coaches don't make the practice just like the game. They make the practice harder than the game. Because if you don't have practice that's harder than the game, you're not going to be ready for the game. And we want to have students doing rich, complex things in our classrooms so they're ready for the test. But really also so that they learn, because that's the goal. And it all starts with getting a sense of what they know up front and making sure that we keep this goal in mind when we're making our numerous decisions that we make every unit, every lesson, every minute working with students, so that we are sure that we are moving them forward and not just getting sidetracked with what's the answer. So most of what I'm telling you is not original with me. It really comes from working with a lot of really great experts, colleagues over the last few years, teachers who have welcomed me into their classrooms and thought with me about what students understood and what they didn't and what we should do about it. So I really appreciate that you're all here. I thank you for being here. I'm sorry we didn't really get to talk, but hopefully I'll see some of you later. All these slides will be posted, Susan tells me, and I would love to know what you're thinking, what you try, how it goes in your classroom. So please do get in touch by email or Twitter or whatever method you like to use. And have a really good day. I think there's a lot of stuff to provoke thought and help you learn. Thanks.